I am James Butler and I'm coming to you from the Novara Media bunker at The World Transformed, and I have the great pleasure of sitting here with Debbie Bookchin. Debbie is a writer and journalist in her own right, but also the daughter of Murray Bookchin, and she's also written sort of pretty extensively on the reception of Murray Bookchin's thought, particularly in the Kurdish liberation movement. I wonder if you could just tell viewers, because I think for people like me, Murray Bookchin is a kind of household name, but I think it's perhaps not as familiar to many others. So could you maybe just give a little account of his thinking and that political journey in particular?
So Murray Bookchin, who died, by the way, in 2006, was a lifelong radical revolutionary. He kind of grew up really from the age of 9 in the Communist Party first, and then for a while he was a Trotskyist, and then his ideas evolved in an anti-state way, and he became an anarchist for many, many decades, until the very end of his life, when he kind of he stopped calling himself an anarchist. He was still every bit a revolutionary, but he started calling himself a communalist, or using communalism to describe some of the political aspects of his ideas. He's most known for developing the theory of social ecology, which is something that tries to not only critique society, but offer a reconstructive view. And he was talking and writing about ecology back in the early 1960s, in other words, a half a century ago, talking about the fact that we have this rapacious attitude towards nature that stems from our capitalist grow or die ethos, and that we can't really heal this relationship with nature until we examine hierarchies between human beings, social relations, that social relations really have to change as a prerequisite. So in many ways, he was sort of prescient about talking about some of the issues that have, in more recent decades, race, in addition to class, in other words, race, issues for LGBTQ, issues around all kinds of status, even in the workplace and others. And so that's kind of was his orientation. Near the end of, well, not near the end of his life, actually, he started focusing in the last 15 or 20 years of his life specifically on political organization, but it's something that he had actually brought up even back in the 1960s, trying to talk about what kinds of forms would be conducive to really ending these hierarchical relations and to creating a more egalitarian society, not just economically, but socially.
I think that's so crucial that it's not just a kind of economic vision. One of the things I think that's perhaps interesting is here, obviously at this conference, you have quite an unusual confluence of a sort of historic social democratic party with all its sort of command and control instincts, and then you have this festival alongside it, which is much more interested, I think, in moving a bit beyond that, actually. And so I wonder if there's something useful that Labour activists could learn from thinking about the way in which, and particularly, yes, those sort of last works, because I know sort of some of the earlier thinking about, which confronts the, some of the dogmas and cliches of sort of Marxism and anarchism in particular, and particularly this kind of purely negationist approach to political activism. I wonder if there are useful things, you think, in that later work that Labour activists could be learning from as they think about how they would like to change and develop the party here.
Well, I could talk about that for hours, but just a little bit to talk about it specifically in terms of political organization. I think that for many, many years, too many years, there has been a kind of dichotomy that that has existed. Sort of, there's the state and there's the streets. There's the social movements, organizing, protests, that kind of politics. you might call it a defensive politics in a sense, because it's generally about protesting something. And then there's the institution, the state, and the question of seizing state power. If you wanted to put it just in very basic terms, you know, a socialist or Marxist idea of seizing state power versus a more anarchist idea of staying outside the state. And I think that, and obviously here with labor, we're talking about state power because, you know, there's Jeremy Corbyn and the hope, very understandably, within Labour that he will be the next prime minister. But I think that what my father's program was, or what he was trying to emphasize, was that there could be a third way, that we don't necessarily have to look at seizing state power. And there are a lot of historical examples, the USSR being just one of them, that indicate that that plan doesn't always work out. But at the same time, that remaining outside of the institutions completely, what I'm, again, in a very general sense, calling a more anarchist perspective, also has limitations. And that this third way involves actually working on the local level, on the municipal level in particular, to try to re-empower people so that this whole sense of disenfranchisement, of neglect, of feeling completely out of control of one's life that has led to the rise in authoritarianism, that can be addressed. And he felt very strongly that the way that you do that is, it seems archaic right now, but literally in face-to-face meetings and assemblies on the neighborhood level. It's one of the things that I know we'll talk about that the Kurds are doing very effectively. But you know, this process, it takes time and it takes work and it takes education, and it's not an overnight thing that happens, but it's something that, for example, in the United States, where I live, the Republicans have been doing very effectively. They've gone into the local councils, into the school boards. They've propagated their, you know, their ideology that way. And my father's hope was that the left could start to really institutionalize this sort of program for social change by working on the local level.
I mean, it's striking, isn't it? Because you do have, I think, particularly when you're thinking about political parties, they have, you know, this sort of dual temporality, right? That has this kind of external election cycle that it's always driven towards, and it can lead to a neglect of those, I think, longer term. You know, and I agree that I think they're kind of fundamental to really transforming society. And I think alongside that, and perhaps one of the things that I find intriguing, is this sense that, you know, within, you know, formal political parties, I'm not thinking just of the Labour Party here, but European parties to the left, the democratic socialists in the States. This sort of movement around Bernie Sanders, who indeed I know that you used to work for, that I wonder whether you feel, do they get pulled too much in a policy direction? And is there something in addition to that they could be thinking about how to build you know, a movement that can endure beyond, you know, achieving just policy change, so stuff just in the institutions?
You know, it partly depends on sort of what you define as radical change. And you talk about policy, and obviously there are many policies that people like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, now also a rising star in the progressive movement, have put out that are important. You know, in our country, $15 minimum wage, universal health care, that kind of thing. And so, yes, people are focused on these policies, and there's no reason not to vote. Obviously, we have to get rid of Trump, just like you have to get rid of Boris Johnson. But the problem is that when we focus only on policy that way, we neglect a very fundamental part of what a real social change should mean. And that is that it can't just be about the economy, an economistic kind of approach. It has to be about really re-empowering people, about ending all kinds of hierarchies of what, you know, the many, many types that there are, racial, LGBT, all these different things. And so the focus on policy sometimes I think leads people to neglect the fact that a more transformational social change can only come when we help people understand, number one, that they deserve not just a $15 minimum wage, but a work environment that's productive and meaningful, that we deserve a society where people can be creative, that we deserve a society where people have control over their own communities and aren't at the mercy of developers, of the whole neoliberal economic order. And the way I think that my father emphasized this, and that I think is exciting because it's happening now more and more in municipalities around the world, the way to do that is to get people involved, whether it's fighting a local development or trying to reform something going on with the education system, getting people involved on the local level, and then expanding that involvement. See, as people become empowered and they see that they can have a voice, running people for local office, and that's very different from running people from regional or national office, but for local office with the idea that they are representatives of their community, of their local assembly, shall we say. And there's great examples of how people in anarchist Spain, in different environments, have come together and done this and been empowered. And I think that kind of social transformation is important and can have a much greater, a much more long-lasting impact than just going to the ballot box or just protesting on the other side.
Tell me, I know, of course, and this is a nice point to talk about it, is that you know, the influence of Murray Bookchin's thought on the experiment in Rojava, in Kurdistan, you know, it just seems astonishing to me that it came about this way. Tell me how it was via Öcalan, right, who had been reading Murray Bookchin, and this has then inspired the movement.
Yeah, it's actually quite a fascinating and odd development in many ways. My father's work was translated into Turkish, and it was being read by people in the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is headed by Abdullah Öcalan, and also by Öcalan himself when he was arrested in 1999 and sent to prison and had the opportunity to spend a lot of time while preparing for his self-defense. In Turkey, he had the opportunity to spend a lot of time reading many books. And one of the works, or several of the works that particularly resonated with him, were some of my dad's books. He wrote a book called The Ecology of Freedom, and other books on cities and on municipal organization. As a result of this, Öcalan decided that the original project of the Kurds, and I'm talking about 15 million Kurdish people in Turkey and another several million in Syria, these are particularly the Kurds that follow Öcalan, that this project really needed to turn away from its traditional Marxist-Leninist roots, and instead of seizing state power, instead of trying to create a separate Kurdish state, to work within the existing state borders in order to have more self-autonomy. And so this project became one in which the Kurds adopted some of my father's ideas about ecology, about non-hierarchy, especially as it pertains to feminism, because the Kurdish movement is, if nothing else, a powerful women's liberation movement, and grassroots democracy, and this idea of empowering people on the local level. And so little by little, in the early 2000s, Öcalan instructed all the mayors in southeast Turkey to read some of my dad's work, and a lot of the people who also were spending some time in Turkey but were originally from Syria, when they returned to Syria at the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, started, and the state sort of removing itself somewhat from that part of the Kurdish region of northern Syria, they began to put these ideas into practice. And of course, they're not just exactly my father's ideas. Obviously, Öcalan has written many books himself and has incorporated and amplified these ideas and especially emphasized women's liberation as a foundational aspect of this revolutionary theory. And so it's been very exciting to see what's going on there.
And I think it's really important to emphasize, it is in the middle of a civil war. And, it's not as if it's you think, okay, well, here in the developed capitalist heartlands, we've not really managed to get it together to do any of this, really. And here you have these people in this, astonishingly fraught and very, very dangerous situation. Insisting not on partial but total social transformation. It's really quite something. I wonder if you could say a little about the sort of difficulties it's facing. I know that both perhaps in terms of kind of putting this stuff into practice, but also I understand there's been another recent wave of repression in Turkey in particular against the Kurdish liberation.
Yeah, it's very difficult. Sometimes when people argue the case sort of against this, what my father called libertarian municipalism and Öcalan calls democratic confederalism, they say, well, of course they were able to do it in Syria. The state withdrew and they just, boom, put up these institutions. But actually, that argument isn't really completely accurate because, first of all, it takes a lot of work and it took a lot of education and there was a lot of planning before this happened. But also in Turkey, the state never really withdrew. In fact, as you mentioned, the regime, we have to call it a regime of Erdogan, is now coming down harder than ever on the Kurds and recently removed the mayors, three of them, of 3 Kurdish cities in the southeast. And so the Kurds have faced tremendous repression. I mean, they have done a lot of this work under terrible, terrible conditions. In Syria, under conditions of war and deprivation. As I'm sure many of your viewers would know, Erdogan invaded Afrin, which was a large area of about 1 million people, mostly Kurdish, but also many other ethnicities. And so now, well, really a year and a half ago, and the looting, the robbery, kidnappings, rapes, it's just been a travesty that the West has not in any way intervened to stop this gross violation of human rights. So the Kurds face great difficulties, and it would be really nice if they got more support from the Western American, British left, as NATO partners. The UK and the United States are really basically complicit in these crimes.
I just want to ask one last question, and it's a question about hope. There's something profoundly hopeful about Bookchin's work. There's something profoundly hopeful about the work that's being done in Rojava. Lots of people at conference are feeling hopeful because we've managed to pass some pretty radical policy this year. Are people right to be hopeful?
People are always right to be hopeful. We have to have hope. There's nothing worth living for if you don't have hope. I think that there have been such great strides made ideologically and practically. I'm, for example, particularly hopeful about the municipalist movement that we see growing in different ways and, in a great variety of techniques and aspects. Barcelona and Camus, in Barcelona, they're doing it one way. Other places, in Frome here, they've done some wonderful municipalist politics. And sometimes it's more radical, sometimes it's less radical, but it's something to build upon. The fact is that really all over the world now, people on the local level are saying, we can take power, we can build a new society within the shell of the old. We can begin with our local organizing and a confederation of localities to actually oppose the power of the nation state and try and slowly reduce that power. And so I think that, and even, you know, when you look at Rojava, how can you not be hopeful about a place where women are empowered, where they're 40% of every legislative body, where they're co-mayors, where they are really truly running a feminist society. So I think that there's a great deal to be hopeful for. I think the more that we try these new forms of organization on the local level and work to confederate together and don't just put all our hope in the ballot box, the better it will be. And I think that, that we have a lot to look forward in the months and years to come.
Debbie Bookchin, thank you very much for joining me.